Good afternoon. I'm Heidi Walker with the Salt Lake Chamber, and we're pleased to have you all join us today. We know a few of you are still logging on. Today, we will hear a great webinar from Natalie Gochnour, who's the Executive Director of the Kem C Gardner Policy Institute and Chief Economist for the Salt Lake Chamber. She'll provide an in-depth look at Utah's economy, and the title of our webinar today is What's on the Horizon for Utah's Economy? As you see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function. Please feel free to go ahead and add any questions you have along the way. And Natalie will prompt Natalie with those questions, or she may see those and answer those as well. So again, we're here from 2 to 3 today. So Natalie, we'll turn the time to you.
Thank you, Heidi. Great to be with all of you. I've put up a slide deck that I'm going to use to get us through this time. I'm going to talk about the Utah economy and what's on the horizon. And I want to thank the Salt Lake Chamber for hosting this series. Really appreciate the leadership of Derek Miller and the whole team there at the Chamber. We can be grateful for having a very engaged and well-led business community. In today's discussion, I'm going to talk about 5 things. I want to just give a quick overview of the economic shock and aftermath that is the COVID-19 recession. Much of this we already know, we've been experiencing it, but just to get us on the same playing field of what we're facing. I want to make the point that Utah has had a relatively strong economic performance compared to other states. I also believe that we do need another federal stimulus, and I'll give a little bit of data and facts behind that opinion of mine. And then we'll conclude by just talking about 2 things that have a longer reach, COVID's long arms. We will come out of this, I believe, with a different economy. This is what we call structural changes. And then we'll talk about what it means to have such high debt loads, something that I'm calling the next shoe to drop. So the shock and aftermath, let's look at something as simple as Salt Lake City International Airport passengers. And you can see us in 2019 and the start of 2020, somewhere around 2 million a month airport passengers. And then March hits and you see them cut in half. And then by the time the April data hits, we've dropped from a steady state of over 2 million to 176,000 passengers. That is the definition of a shock to a system. That is the definition of falling off a cliff. And I just wanted to show you how stark that is in something as hardly hit as the airline industry. Most of the time, we like to look at it in terms of unemployment claims. And this is the time series of new unemployment claims. This particular series I'm showing you includes the traditional unemployment claims, plus the extended and expanded pandemic unemployment claims that capture the so-called gig workers and self-employed. But you can see how we hit a peak of 33,000 in 1 week. And the yellow line at the bottom of this graphic is the 2019 average, which is south of 2,000 weekly average. And we hit 33,000 at peak. And then you can see us come down off that peak, what we have in May, and then you can see us just holding steady. And in the most recent data, dropping off a bit. Another way that economists like to look at this is in terms of continuing claims. So people ask for unemployment insurance, and then they get hired and they come off of it. This is the series of continuing claims, which peaked at 126,000 in early May and have now dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. And we sit now, less than 75,000 in our state. Still a chilling number. You can see normally that would be around 8,000 a week. That's the yellow line there. But here we sit. And this shows you how much more we've got to come away. When you look at it on an unemployment rate expected, it looks like this. So the gray line is the United States unemployment rate, and the red line is Utah's. And you can see both Utah and US having this nice downward glide path. And then the economic shock hits, the pandemic, the basic deactivation of the economy, shoots up north of 14% for the US and just north of 10% for Utah. And for the most recent data, note how Utah's unemployment rate at 5.1% and the US at 11.1. So we're, feeling half the impact there. Now, I will note that this data will be updated on Friday. We'll get new numbers. Many believe that this 5.1% in Utah will bump around a bit, maybe a little low. This is a difficult time to estimate, data like this, but that's the official data at this point. Similar graphic here, only instead of unemployment, I'm showing job change. So year over job change in each of these monthly indicators, what's the year over percent change? And here, Utah in red again, always above the gray line, that's Utah outperforming the nation. But you can see how we move with the nation, and currently the Utah economy contracting. This is a June 2019 to a June 2020, contracting at 2.8%, and the nation contracting on that year over basis by 8.7%. Perhaps the most interesting and telling story of this downturn is what is it doing by industry? And it is claiming favorites. It's definitely punishing some industries more than others, and no industry is that more hard felt than the leisure and hospitality services, where we have a June to June year over decline of nearly 21%. The only other one in the double digits is natural resources at a minus 10.4. That's largely Utah's energy sector, as we've had some disruptions in oil prices and the like. We also have a slowing global demand, which depresses prices for commodities and makes it so we do less mining in our state. As you look at the other industries, I wanted to note, it is interesting to see that government has experienced job declines over this time period. And then also to note that the construction sector at 8.7% growth, that's a really strong growth number. And it's happening during an economic crisis. And so the construction sector ends up between all that we're doing for, infrastructure, whether it's transportation, whether it's the airport, whether it's housing, some of the big projects that you see going in around the state, those workers are still able to work. They're outside, they're socially distant. And so we're able to continue that job growth. And that's a really positive development for our state. So now I want to just transition to talk a little bit about Utah's relatively strong economic performance. And I'm going to do that just by looking at a map. And this map, of course, is giving you a sense of job change year over percent. We've already mentioned that Utah's declined by 2.8. But what is not as widely known, and this map makes clear, is that of all 50 states, Utah and Idaho are tied for having the smallest contraction. And I never thought having a small contraction would actually be good news. But everyone's contracting, as you can see. You can see our neighbor to the west, Nevada, with a very specialized economy focused on tourism and gaming. Hawaii has a similar phenomenon, double-digit losses. And then a big deal to see California with that kind of contraction, and Utah's a fraction of that. So we're best of class, and it also shows up in our unemployment rate, where you can see Utah's at 5.1%, second best in the nation, only West Virginia showing better. And of course, all of these measures have their pluses and minuses, but all in all, I would say this has been a sudden, severe, and uneven economic impact, and that Utah has performed relatively well compared to other states. It might be also interesting to just look at retail sales on a monthly basis in Utah. These numbers are in millions here. This is taxable retail sales. You can see the Christmas bump, and you come back down here, but it's been really interesting to state leaders to see that our retail sales have held as strong as they have. And I'll just mention to you that this will be one of the structural changes that we're talking about, because we're buying things differently. I'll show you that in just a minute. So I'm happy to pause there if there are any questions. I don't know, Marissa, if you've seen any that have come in through the chat box. I haven't been able to look at that yet, but feel free to hit me with a question if you have. And if not, I want to talk about the federal stimulus.
Natalie, we have one question that says, shouldn't the unemployment graph be a stacking bar chart since those are new, but it's cumulative?
So we're going back to this one right here. Oh, let's see if I can find it. New weekly unemployment claims. And I don't know if that's the one, but this one, of course, I'm just showing the new ones coming in that week. And when they stack, they start to look like that, with the exception that some come off. So I don't know if that helps, but that's a way to respond to that.
They said thank you. So the next question we have is, where does the tech sector fit from a jobs perspective?
Right. Well, thank you for that. The tech sector is interesting in that regard. I'll call this up again. And the reason it's interesting is that the tech sector crosses over different industries. So it's largely the information sector. You can see that at a minus 1.5%. But there's also tech that we would call manufacturing. If you're building computer hardware and software, we like to think of that as tech, but it's also manufacturing. Some of our medical device companies end up being in manufacturing. So you can see a decline of 1.4 there. And then some of it can actually, you know, there's tech that can show up in retail trade, and there's tech that can show up in professional and business services. So it's cutting across a lot of these industries. And then let's just keep in mind, tech is a part of every job these days, right? So we have industries and we have occupations. What I'm showing you here are industries. They don't follow so nicely into what we think of as like a tech job, because that's really an occupation, a programmer, you know, someone who is in sales, someone who does sales for a software company. They're still going to be categorized as information sector, even though they're doing sales. So I just make the point, I guess, that tech doesn't fit in nicely, but if you wanted the bellwether for it, it'd be that information sector right there. Okay, very good. Keep the questions coming, because you know, there's no reason why I should monologue this with such a great group on. You represent so many industries and so many perspectives, and I obviously can learn a lot from your perspective as well. Well, I mentioned that there is a need for federal stimulus in my mind. This is, you know, one of the things I wanted to highlight. And if you just take a U.S. perspective on this, and what we're seeing on a national level is our best like quick indicator is UI claims, because they come in like every week, every 2 weeks. So it's very quick, the measure. And so you can see US unemployment claims. All that's saying up top is that this is in thousands and it's non-seasonally adjusted. But you see how the claims came down, and then June hit, and we've basically been moving sideways. And we've been moving sideways for over a month. And there's a really good reason why we're moving sideways, right? Because the PPP monies have really run their course. The extended unemployment insurance has done a lot of what it was going to do. And a lot of the initial adaptations have occurred. The easy things are done, so we're moving sideways. So we've got basically 4 proposals that are being debated, and I'm really simplifying this. And if there is someone on the call from one of our congressional delegations, please welcome you giving us a dose of what's happening in Washington. But you know, several weeks ago, the House, which I'll think of as the Democrats, passed a $3.4 trillion HEROES Act. That's a very rich stimulus. The prior stimulus was about 2.4 trillion, just to give you a sense of magnitude. So this is, I can't remember the number, but it's like 13% of GDP. It's a huge number. Senate Republicans, before leaving for August recess, it looked like we're settling in around a $1 trillion stimulus package. So you can see a pretty big difference there. And then we had President Trump, I believe it was on August 8th, sign his executive orders. And these executive orders, if you could implement them all, and if you put a dollar amount to all of them, it was about 400 billion. But that's optimistic, because I don't think they will all move into effect, either for legality reasons or practical reasons. But it gives you a sense of the spread And then the macro model that I follow most closely is what Moody's Analytics puts out, and they believe we need about a $1.5 trillion. That's pretty much their lowest level, which you can see would fit nicely into a compromise, if you will. Well, so let's talk a little bit about what President Trump did in his executive orders. I'm going to simplify them by saying 4. One that took FEMA's disaster relief monies and converted them into unemployment insurance, an additional $400 a week, where the feds would pay $300 and the states would pay $100. Therefore, you get the $400. I'll come back to that in a minute. Then you have a temporary cut in payroll taxes, so a 1-year deferral for employees. He tries to income target this to be employees making less than $100,000. This one's a bit controversial because, of course, the payroll taxes are what funds Social Security and Medicare, and these are trust funds that are already in grave danger of insolvency in the near future. And so, that fiscal hawks don't like cutting the payroll tax. President also asked for an evictions moratorium. It's what I would call weak tea. He can't just do that by executive fiat. So there's kind of weak language that's, says consider temporary help to renters. So we don't really know what that would mean. And then the student loan delay to defer payments through the end of the year. I think this is helpful, certainly helpful to the individuals that benefit from it. It's just not enough to, have a really strong macro measurable impact. And so I would just summarize by saying that when economists look at how we stimulate the economy, we're always worried about debt because that's how we would be doing that here, but this is a national emergency. So we're looking for economic stimulus that's stimulative, that has a large multiplier. And what that really means is the money's got to be spent. It can't be saved. So this is just an example from the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office and Moody's of what we think the gross domestic product multipliers are by various levels of stimulus. SNAP is what most people think of as like food stamps. It's a nutrition program, and it's very stimulative because people that get that immediately spend it. Enhanced unemployment insurance is similar. If you're unemployed, you spend it because you don't have other source of income, and it gets paid for your rent and your food and your transportation. Aid to state and local governments, a high multiplier. An increase in Medicaid. This is the FMAP as it's called, but it's the matching level that the federal government will provide to states. And I'll let you look at these as they go down there. The stimulus checks, by the way, shows up as the lowest, but this is a little bit complicated because it really depends how they structure that. If they did stimulus checks to people making less than $60,000 a year, in my judgment, that would be quite stimulative because those would be spent. But when they do it for higher income levels or all taxpayers, then it's not nearly as stimulative because that money can be held or, put in savings. So that's a little bit of thinking about a stimulus. Let me go back and look over at questions. I can see these, Marissa, but it's actually helpful to me if you just kind of phrase them for me.
Sure thing. So the first question we have is, with COVID having led to employers becoming more comfortable with remote working, do you think the Wasatch Front's housing shortage is relieved over time as people on the Wasatch Front work remotely, or do you see even more pressure from people moving in from other states?
That is a question that's going to require a lot of reflection from a lot of us because there's always short-term and long-term ways of thinking about that. So on the housing shortage, the Gardner Policy Institute estimates that we still have a 40 to 50,000 unit shortage in housing. And this is built up over time and is a function of new households being formed, so this aging population, and also in migration, people moving into our state. My read right now is that with California reeling, and with remote work becoming so much more attractive, accepted, functional, we're seeing a lot of people that are selling homes in California, moving to places like Park City or other places in Utah, and keeping the same income lowering their housing costs and getting a better quality of life. And that will put pressure on housing, right? Now that's a higher end. But I bring up those points to say that there's really no easy answer to that question. But I'd make just these observations. We believe that the housing shortage will continue for at least the next couple of years because it's just that much pent up demand. Second, there's definitely a California effect going on, and we'll know more about that in the months to come. And then third, there's more things about ready to hit Utah's real estate sector when we talk about commercial real estate. And I'll do that when I jump to this next topic. Hope that's helpful. Marissa, what else do we have?
We have a question that asks, what long-term effects do you see resulting from the enormous increase in the federal deficit due to the stimulus packages?
So I'm going to defer that one because I will answer that question in just a few minutes. But I think it's really important, if we're going to talk about stimulus, we should also talk about debt, and I will do that very shortly. How about another one, Marissa?
If the economy was allowed to completely get back to work, what would we need additional debt finance stimulus?
Okay, right. So if people are working, if the economy is functioning, if we have, gotten through this rough patch, the stimulus is less needed, right? There's still going to be people that have had their businesses destroyed and they've had a lot of disruptive things happen in the economy. And I think there'll still be a lot of need for aid, but it would be more in the category of helping people get back on their feet rather than sustaining an economy so there's not additional damage. And I hope people understand that difference. So with something like COVID, that has actually changed the nature of the economy. It's made some companies go bankrupt. I'm going to go through these structural changes, but it's changed the way we work and the way we travel and kind of what we're doing. So when that happens, the economy changes, and you don't want to keep propping up things that have gone away. You want to retrain people and get them back on their feet. That's an important investment that you can make, but it's different than trying to make it so people don't go out of business and try to hold score for what we have. So I hope that's helpful, and I'll address some of these structural changes here in just a minute. My good friend Andrew Gruber has a question. What's this one, Marissa?
He asks, would it be too administratively burdensome to distribute stimulus checks based on country HUD income limits, i.e. people who qualify as making 80% or less of their county average median income?
Yeah, so Andrew's pointing out here that we actually have data that would inform us, at a local level, how to distribute stimulus checks to households of greatest need. And I don't think that would be too administratively burdensome. You always have to think of that because administrative burden is a form of inefficiency or deadweight loss. But I think it's very important when you do a stimulus to be targeted and prioritized. And there is no question that in the COVID-19 world, the places you want to target are industries that have been hardest hit, households that have been hardest hit, and people in our multicultural community that have been hardest hit by virtue of their culture, living arrangements, occupations, whatever it might be. Any more questions, Marissa?
We have one more. It says the S&P 500 hit a record high today. Is that a good indicator of the state of the economy? And how does that impact the average Utahn?
So I would say that what the S&P 500 performance is a good indicator of is how good of a job the Federal Reserve Bank is doing in keeping the markets confident in that they have their backing. And so we have this pandemic that creates a health crisis, and the health crisis creates an economic crisis. And in an economic crisis, you have several things you can do, but the two main things you can do are monetary policy, fiscal policy. And when it's a crisis, you got to use both. So on the monetary front, you lower interest rates, you put up credit facilities that help keep money flowing in the economy, keep the economy working. And that's what the Fed has been doing, and they've been doing an exceptional job of it. On the fiscal side, that's the spending and taxation activities of the federal government. And I actually would give our federal government quite very high marks there, with the exception of they should have done something before they went on their August recess. But I think the federal fiscal response to date has been pretty proportional to what was needed, given the severity of the challenge. So I don't see, to get back to the question, I don't see the daily fluctuations of the S&P 500 as much an economic indicator as I see it as a confidence indicator that the Fed's doing a good job and doing their part to keep us strong. Okay, let's jump to the long arms of COVID and structural change. And I've shared this with some of you before, but there's an author that I quite like her work, and she said, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. So I'm using this to just kind of set up. So what does this mean? If you think about it right now, we could go almost any place on planet Earth and talk to someone and say, what's the most significant challenge facing humanity or facing the planet, facing our world today? And I would guess that in the high 90 percentiles, they would say the pandemic. And you have to just think to yourself, that's very, very rare. This is a jaw-dropping event. It's a body blow to a lot of things happening. And so there's no way that you have that kind of impact without it creating something new. And when we think of things that are created new, economists like to think of them in terms of structural trends. And so I put up this little diagram here to show you that cyclical trends, this is what we think of as the business cycle. There's ups and downs. It's basically, people innovate and efficiencies are created and we prosper, but then we start taking risks we shouldn't take. We get complacent. We overinvest. We get imbalances in the economy, and then you have to correct. And then you correct and you decline for a bit and you come back up. And this is the business cycle. And there's no like regular rhythm to it. You'll hear people say, oh, there's 7-year forces, but it depends on when there's a need for a market correction. When does an imbalance get created? Really separate from that is the notion of a structural trend. And a structural trend, I'm just showing it here in like a magnitude, is something that makes the world different. And usually it comes down to just a few things. Usually it's a change in the demographics. Like age structure can create huge structural trends. An aging population changes how we, where people can live, how housing is designed, changes the way they get around, changes transportation, certainly changes our healthcare sector, changes what they spend money on, changes our tax structure. So demographics is a huge reason for a structural trend. Another structural trend is technology, right? As technology changes, we change the way the economy functions. So what we're all asking is, what does COVID-19 mean to the future economy? And this is something that everyone's still thinking a lot about. So this is US data I'm showing you here, and this is the winners and losers in US retail sales. So this is the percent change July, so last month, versus February 2020. So we're saying, where were they before the pandemic and how much did they change now? And of course, if you're on the left side of this, you've contracted. And if you're on the right side of this, you've grown. And I already showed you the data. I'll flip back to it real quickly, where I showed that retail sales is kind of holding its own in Utah, which is really, this is one of the reasons why our state government hasn't had to cut the budget as much. We still, have some serious fiscal issues, but retail sales have held relatively strong. Well, the reason that's happening is there's a shift occurring, and people are spending less money in restaurants and less money on motor fuel, and less money on clothing, and they're spending a lot more money online. That's for one thing. Spending a lot more money on, you know, home improvement and outdoor equipment. That's the sporting goods one there. And so you can just kind of see these shifts. Now, I would argue that these shifts are rather short term, right? They're happening during a pandemic. These aren't so much structural, but I thought you'd find it interesting. And this would be more like in this cycle, this is how things are happening. Here's a list of the structural changes that the Gardner Institute's keeping a close eye on. So we're in a zero interest rate environment, a flat yield curve, and it's very difficult for banks to have you know, high interest margins or anything in this kind of environment. And it's asking the question, is there a new banking paradigm? When you combine the financial realities that banks face with all the technology realities, in other words, doing everything without branches, but just doing them on your smartphones, what does that mean in this banking paradigm? And let's be honest, many of these things were happening pre-COVID, but COVID has accelerated them or made them more real, brings the future closer faster. Deglobalization would be a second one, and this one we're kind of combining this trend to reshore with the trend of shorter supply chains. And this is an example of a structural trend that could be positive for Utah, because shorter supply chains, in my estimation, Utah will be a net winner there because of our strategic location in the interior Western United States. We're dead center for the fastest growing region in the country, you know, in a steady state world. And we have I-15 and I-70 and I-84 and I-80 and this beautiful new airport we're about ready to cut the ribbon on, and incredible rail connectivity. We're equidistant between the Canadian border, the Mexican border, you know, the Continental Divide and the Pacific Ocean. Shorter supply chains, we can do really well in that environment. Tech-enabled services, this is another example where these were already happening, but, you know, remote work will never be the same. Telemedicine won't be the same. Remote sales have been going on for a long time, but everyone just got better at it and started to like it. And, you know, online education, I'll be teaching 35 students this fall. I'll be doing my class completely online. I've completely reconstituted my curriculum, and I'll have to go a semester to know whether it's better, but it will be good. And so that's a structural change that we're seeing. And then lastly, this notion of a reckoning in commercial real estate. And this is because there's behavioral changes occurring. And when I use that term, I'm meaning, you know, if people are going to start choosing to work from home more, if employees favor that, if they see good productivity from it, that's going to change demand for office space. If you have to have greater distances in office spaces because of the confidence that you need in a pandemic, short term or even medium term, that will change the layout and demand in commercial real estate. And then let's not forget the hardest hit places in commercial real estate have been hotels, retail, and restaurants. So, you know, the term that I've been using is a reckoning. There's going to be a rebalancing, and I'm sure there's a lot of you on the call that know a lot about this, so we welcome that if you want to speak up. Marissa, let's jump to some questions again.
Okay, the first one is, anticipating that the county average wages decrease, should the state and municipalities adjust their tax reimbursement incentive requirement for companies to pay 110% of the county average wage?
Okay, so I have to read a lot into that question, and I may be getting this incorrectly, but I believe what they're saying is that in our state, to get an incentive, you have to pay somewhere, you know, close to the county average wage. And the person is asking, given COVID-19 and it depressing wages, should somehow the incentive be changed to be less or more? I don't know exactly what would we want to do there, but I guess I would just say that's a fine question to ask. It should be talked about. It is a different environment, but it's not clear to me whether I would yet recommend that. Next question, Marissa.
They say, my motto in government was don't let a good crisis go by without some change. Is this pandemic a time to get rid of the GDP and replace it with a more sophisticated indicator of wellness or health?
So I think a lot of people would welcome that. I'll just give the audience the background to know that, you know, gross domestic product is our broadest grand measure of what's going on in the economy. It's really a measure of, you know, value added in the economy. It doesn't double count. It includes, it's very broad, covers a lot of things, but it's criticized a lot because, you know, the more you produce, the better the measure. And so you could produce really cheap stuff that's not long lasting and the measure keeps going up. You could produce things that aren't of value and the measure keeps rising. And so I would just say that there's, for as long as I've studied economics, there's been a request for broader measures of economic health. And in the spirit of not letting a good crisis go to waste, I'm sure there'll be a lot of research on how we might measure that given the extent of this pandemic. Well, let's jump in to the thought of debt loads. And I'm characterizing this as the next shoe to drop. And I don't know if all of you know where that term comes from, but I believe it comes from housing in New York City that was kind of, you know, inexpensive housing. And it was said that your neighbor above you would get home at night and take their shoe off and you'd hear it drop to the floor. And you just knew with certainty that that second shoe would drop. And so it's an expression that says, you know, given what we know, what happens next? And what we know is that we're borrowing a lot of money. And this is data that I pulled together to just kind of make this point. The only thing that's controversial here are maybe those yellow lines, but I'm showing the debt held by the public, which we think is the best measure of debt for what I'm using here. You could do a gross debt, which would include government transfers and things, but I'm just looking at debt held by the public in all of these years, because I wanted to get World War II in here and you know, certainly have the Korean War, the Vietnam War in here, have the financial crisis in here. And you can see what happened in the financial crisis. And I think what's deeply troubling to many economists, though not all, is that during the longest sustained expansion in our nation's history, which is right in this period right here, we continued to borrow at these high levels. Now keep in mind, this isn't how much you're borrowing, this is how much you're borrowing as a percent of all the activity going on in your economy. It's very stimulative, by the way, to do that. And it would have been so much better had we you know, gotten through the crisis and then stopped borrowing so much money. Would have put us in a better situation here to address this need. But that's now water under the bridge, and I'm in favor of additional stimulus because that's the immediate need, and we'll figure out a way to pay this back. But look at what these borrowing levels have done, right? Because by the time we're done, we will have spent about 20% of GDP on stimulus. That's $1 in every $5 in the economy. That's just a stunning number. So, you know, this is the world we're in, and this, you know, in many ways needs to happen to minimize economic harm and the like. But look at something like this. This is what people are calling the COVID-19 fiscal cliff. This is the monthly change in federal debt in billions of dollars, just for, you know, this year, and you can see the impact of COVID. And you can also see why another stimulus starts to, we've been pumping all this money into the economy that otherwise would be somewhere else, right? Someone loaned us this money. And you can see the CARES Act passes, they extended the tax filing deadline, the peak of stimulus checks, late July when the unemployment insurance expired, that was the extra $600 a week. And so here we sit, but with an economy still traveling sideways, upside down, and we've got to get through what could be a long winter. I think the next shoe to drop is the debt, and for a lot of reasons, I think that we still need to take on more debt. But I've been a big fan of what Senator Romney has proposed. I believe it was the Trust Act, but it's this idea of let's pair a stimulus with the idea of once this is over, we seriously engage in entitlement reform. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. Let's see if we've got any additional questions, Marissa.
We don't have any additional questions, just a comment.
Okay.
Say that I don't think we'll ever pay this debt back, at least not in the lifetime of anyone on this call.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. You know, I get asked about this debt a bit, and what I typically say is I think of debt like I do termites in a house. And I compare it to like in the Three Little Pigs where the wolf comes and tries to blow the house down. That's not what debt does. Debt is more, insidious. It's in the woodwork, and as it's in there, it makes interest rates rise, and it crowds out private borrowing. If you're borrowing a lot in the public sector, there's less private borrowing, less availability of that money, and private borrowing is used for really important things, and we want people to invest and borrow. But federal debt also crowds out, by way of interest payments, other important federal expenditures. So it's a very difficult thing to have. And then to this person's point on, us not being able to pay it back in our lifetimes, the one on the call, that's absolutely true. And that's where you start to think of the moral issues implied here. When you have this level of borrowing, are we really okay passing that on to our grandchildren and their children? And I'm going to say, from my perspective, and I've come from sort of a mainstream perspective on this. Right now, we need to invest in this economy. We are suffering, and we need to ameliorate that suffering. And if we can pay, or borrow more now, or have a lot more suffering later. And I think we've got to do it. But in the years to come, we have got to put ourselves in a situation where we borrow less, as a moral issue and an economic issue. We are at 2:42. I know it looks like we've got one more question, which I'm happy to ask, but I'll just invite, if people have other questions, let's put them in there. I'm happy to respond. I just say that in my thinking, I've had, basically these 5 conclusions from the work that I was hoping to present to you today, that this has been a really supersized economic impact. And the whole idea of it being a shock is that it's sudden, severe, and in this case, it's been uneven. I do think the worst is over. I could be wrong. We could have something much worse happen in a long winter or a dangerous fall. But my point is that we've already made so many adaptations, and we don't have to go make those again. And the plea I would make is, let's keep being smart. There's absolute convincing evidence that if we can keep the virus at bay, the economy will do better. So that's why mask wearing and distancing and hygiene are so important. We have been Utah strong. We fared better than most states. We do need additional stimulus to avoid hardship down the road. We've got structural changes on their way. And I would encourage business leaders to think intently about what structural changes might affect your business and see around the corner and get ahead of them. And then this borrowing frenzy has created debt loads that will be our next shoe to drop. If we get in an environment where we have rising interest rates and a recession at the same time, those often don't go together, but they can, that would be really bad for us. All right, Marissa, let's go to the concluding questions.
Okay, we've gotten a couple more since you asked for them. Going through the list that they were received, what are your ideas on universal income?
So universal basic income is a proposal that is a way to provide income support. It is very efficient to administer because you don't, it's not means tested, and you just send it out, and it's a way to make sure that everybody has a basic level of income in our society. It's controversial because it, for some people, because of the incentive that it puts out there, or an incentive to not work, to not do things. But it does have some economic merits.
Okay, the next question, which I think you are on slide 25, is do you think this strengthens the case for increasing wages?
Is that this one? Which slide do you think? Strengthen the case for,
I think you were talking about when we were discussing for our grandchildren, and
okay.
we don't want to
Well, yeah, just the whole thought for increasing wages. So if you just think about that, that's not something government does. That's something that business gets to do based on the return that they get from work. And so I would not be interested in the government increasing wages, but I would be interested in business leaders rewarding workers that are creating value. And in this environment, there's going to be opportunities to do that because innovation and talent are going to be needed.
Okay, what do you see as the impact to households with the economic realities that will continue from COVID-19?
So the way I want to think about that is that I see the impact as being very unequal. And I put back this new weekly unemployment claims. People that are being laid off, they're some of the hardest hit. And of course, a lot of people have the good fortune of being in work that lends itself to working remotely. But for people who don't have that, they're very hard hit. And so, I think this is a time when you need to definitely invest in taking care of people that are hard hit. And I'll just give a plug for the state's plan here. So Utah Leads Together has an economic recovery and revitalization plan. This is done under the leadership of Governor Herbert, but with legislative partnership. Certainly the lieutenant governors provided leadership there as well. And the state has a plan, right? They have a plan to get these laid off workers reattached. To the extent they don't get reattached, they've got scholarship money waiting to help retrain these workers. I've seen some great outcomes to that in my own neighborhood. And then they have an idea. It's not going to happen this week in the special session, but it might happen in ensuing legislative sessions, but for accelerated bonding that would help keep workers working in the construction sector, given that it's such an important sector and that it has high multiplier effects, and we have needs as a growing state. So we absolutely need to be on our game, very carefully monitoring the economy. And let's not forget that the real way that the economy gets back on its feet is not from government spending, but from individual businesses innovating and iterating off of a plan and trying to get us back to a point where we can create value.
Okay, so our next question is, current levels of spending are on par with public spending during World War II. Should our collective thinking shift? Should we consider our nation at war with the virus?
It's a very clever question. When you look at this graphic, it looks like a war, doesn't it? We had a war against the financial crisis that's coming up here in 08, 09, 2010. The question is, after the crisis, we had 10 plus years of expansion. Why didn't we come back down? And we did not. So that will be the next thing that's written about is how we, in the good times, didn't save for a rainy day, or in this case, not borrow. But there's no question we're at war with the virus. This is I called it earlier, a jaw-dropping event. It's history in the making. And it's not just a health crisis, it's an economic crisis. And who knew that we'd be having a 2020 like this?
Okay, how big a role do you see a flight to security and prosperity in Utah from other states playing a role in our future growth?
So this flight to security and prosperity to Utah, I mentioned earlier that we sit at the center of what is in recent times the fastest growing region in the US. That's the Intermountain West. And one of the great economic advantages in the Intermountain West is we're close to California, but we're not California. And economist Thane Robson taught me very early on, I know all of you remember, many of you remember Thane, but he said, you know, in the short term, when California suffers, we benefit. But in the long term, if California suffers, we suffer. And it was just a way of teaching a young economist in me that our economy is so connected nationally and, you know, with the West Coast and the like. And so, yeah, we are benefiting right now from California's woes, and that can continue for a short amount of time. But I would be the first to say that we need a healthy California, because that's in the long-term interest of Utah for all of the things we do, whether it's to buy from California or to sell to California.
Okay. Did the nice decline, oh crap, it moved. Did the nice decline in the ratio from the 40s to the 70s occur because of growth in GDP, or did we actually pay down any debt?
Well, and so the comment I'd make there is either one's fine with me, right? Because what I'm thinking of is that the size of our economy is an indicator of our, you know, ability here to encumber debt and to take on debt. And what I want to do is see a nice balance between what you're doing in the economy and what you're borrowing for. And, you know, you don't have to look at this for too long to see. I believe that the average over this time period is about 40%. And that's before this most recent rise. And so by every measure, we're borrowing at levels that are, you know, not consistent with our past when we're hurting like this. Any other questions, Marissa?
Do you believe there is a canary in the coal mine? We have low interest rates and a high housing demand and a growing construction sector, obviously filling the need of the home building activities, all driving up the housing prices. If interest rates rise, making it more expensive to borrow, do we see a slowdown in construction-related activities, thus creating job losses in the construction sector? And do we run the risk of a bubble bursting?
So I would be reluctant to say that I could, you know, predict all of that and what would happen there. But let's be honest, people can get a home mortgage loan right now for under 3%. That's, you know, never happened. That's very, you know, different for our economy. And so I guess what I would say is that this is definitely a time to pay close attention to a lot of these economic fundamentals, and in your own area of expertise or where you have risk, to monitor it closely. But I don't see in the near term a canary in the coal mine in the housing, construction, and real estate sector, with the exception of commercial real estate, and to the extent that any of these multifamily projects get ahead of themselves.
Okay, our next question is, Salt Lake hotels and the Salt Palace are empty without conventions and business meetings. Many other businesses are affected as a result. Combined that with no sporting events and a diminished number of cultural events, any estimate as to how long it will take for downtown Salt Lake City to recover once things return to some level of normalcy?
Thank you for the question. You know, I've been reading quite a bit about what happens when they have a vaccine, and how they take it to scale, and how it gets implemented, you know, who gets it first, how does that all play out? And I think any informed reading of the closure of the COVID-19 crisis would tell you that it's going to take time. It's going to take time because you're going to have the vaccine production issues, you're going to have the vaccine adoption issues, heaven forbid, but I think I can stand on strong ground when I say that vaccine use will be politicized. And then you'll have, you know, prioritization, certainly healthcare workers and older adults. There's going to be a prioritized listing of vaccines. And then you got to have consumer confidence that it's working, that there's not side effects. And so to the person's question, you know, we said in May of 2020, with this fresh on us in March, to have a 2-year plan. And that would have started in March 2020 and go through March 2022. And I don't see anything that has changed, at least my thinking on that. I think everyone should have a 2-year plan and then continue to iterate off that plan. And we might have to add another 6 months to it or another year to it. Now, let's be clear. We live in a state, and Marissa, this can be something I can end on if you want, or we can do some more questions, but we live in a state that's performing relatively better than other states, economically speaking. We have a very low case fatality rate in Utah. Our numbers have been moderating. Our positivity rate is dropping, but very slowly. But, you have to just sort of put odds to what we see happening in the future. And there's a chance that we get through the fall and into the first quarter and have a vaccine, and this gets behind us more quickly. I think none of us, I'm not going to, put odds on that because I just don't know. Because there's another chance that we have the virus come on in the fall in a very significant way, and we have to deal with that. And then that changes the dynamics. And so, the points I've basically said is have a plan, be engaged. As you iterate around that plan, you can actually get invigorated during a crisis. And a business leader who taught me that, don't focus on the problem, focus on solutions. And when you focus on solutions, everything gets easier and you start to, manage your way through this very difficult time. Marissa, with that, I think I'll just end there and invite, if there are other questions that the Chamber wants to collect and have me respond to, I can certainly try to do that. I hope this has been a helpful session for everybody. I will just say that if you've enjoyed it, I'm happy to do it again for the Chamber in another couple of months, and let's, see how we're doing. And if I just could have one comment to everybody, I guess I'd just say, these are amazing times. Let's do what we can to help and serve others because this virus is mean. It's creating a very difficult circumstance for our economy, and we all need each other during this time. Thank you so much. I'll turn the time back to Heidi.
Well, thank you, Natalie. We appreciate your time today. Just for all of you who have been on the call with us today, this will be a recorded message. You'll receive an email back out from us with all the details and information. Natalie, thank you again for your time and your insight. Have a good day.
My pleasure. Thanks, Heidi.